Oh, right. Okay. Did you hear that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
recording
recording.
in progress.
Yeah, I better be on my best behaviour, aren't I? Right. Okay. Okay. Right. Managed to set up my presentation in the middle. Right. Let's get back to. Right. Okay. Okay. So this is very much, I don't know, a little bit of a labour of love, this presentation, because it arose very much from what I understood to be quite traumatic experiences my colleagues were having this time last year, to be honest. I mean, at that point, I was just having very informal conversations with people. Well, not so much informal, actually, because some of it was around my role as PBS manager. And also, I was then an auditor. So I had a lot of formal contact, but lots of, quite anguished conversations around things like the availability of PPE, the illness and death of a lot of people that we supported. I say a lot, there's probably about 12 to 15 people, but they're all premature deaths, really, all elderly people, but people who you felt had a little bit more life in them. Fear about the situation, and real concerns about the impact on the people that we supported. That was a theme which sort of came out quite loud and clear throughout the study that I did. Everybody focused very much on the folks that they supported. It was very heartwarming. So I decided, as you do, to sort of do a qualitative research project following a model which was very much focused on practice, and was, really sort of designed. Oh, somebody's coming in. Yeah, really designed to sort of help uncover new information. So I ended up with 16 participants, all on the learning disability side, because I was encouraged to focus on that sort of client group. Had to do the ethics proposal and work out a way to do these interviews. And I substantially did them via Zoom, because Zoom was the big thing in those days. It still is, isn't it? I ended up having to do a couple on the telephone and a couple of in-person ones right towards the end when the restrictions are lifted somewhat. I much preferred doing them on Zoom, to be honest, because I could record it and it was just a lot easier from a practical point of view. Of course, I did them on Zoom because of the restrictions. Okay. Right, so the interviews were at least 3/4 of an hour long. Sometimes they went on a lot longer. I kept it as open-ended as possible, really. But I did use some prompts based on my conversations and the literature that was emerging about this. And I focused on two themes, really. Stressors relating to COVID. Stressors are for staff, that is, support workers and people working very closely with people, and coping strategies. Of course, I was very mindful that this could have been quite upsetting for people. So I had to sort of, factor that in, really, the fact that, talking about stuff like that, those traumatic memories in some cases might be quite upsetting for people. Of course, I had to reassure people that confidentiality would be respected. Although I don't think people really minded too much about that sort of stuff, because they wanted to be heard. That was the thing that came across. People it was potentially distressing, but people really embraced the chance to talk about both what had upset them and also what they did to sort of help themselves and help one another to cope with the situation. Why focus on staff? Originally, I wanted to sort of do the whole lot, people we support plus staff, but that would have made too big a sort of study. I think the ethical sort of side of things would have been a little bit more difficult to overcome. So I ended up focusing on staff because support staff have a massive part in the lives of people we support, a disproportionate part, because folks we support with learning disabilities, they don't have big networks. The staff tend to be, rightly or wrongly, a massive part of people's lives. I was mindful also with my PBS head on that staff are the main people who implement PBS plans. The triadic model. You've got the people we support, focus people. We've got the practitioner, PBS specialists, but it's staff who are the mediators, the implementers of PBS plans. I was very conscious of the burden of responsibility felt by staff during the pandemic to get things right. It was a genuine burden, accentuated, exacerbated by the fact that often people felt like they were working in isolation. And of course, anything which affects staff well-being impacts on people we support. And we know that research indicates that care of poor mental health is a risk factor for behaviours that challenge. Basically, this slide is my pitch for the connection with positive behavioural support. About, it is a PBS network, and everything that we present should have a PBS theme. So I guess this is it really. How does this fit in with positive behavioural support? Okay, normally I would be putting you into groups, wouldn't I, to sort of do this activity, but you constitute a group in yourself, as you are. So what I'm hoping is, let's stop sharing for a little while. What's the sort of stressors that you experience? I don't know if you work directly with people. I expect some of you might have a little bit, but even if you didn't, you could probably empathize with people who did. And maybe it's handy also just to listen to the sort of stressors that you did experience during the pandemic. So this is your opportunity to sort of unburden yourself and sort of talk about those sort of things, really. Has anybody got any thoughts on that? Stressors associated with COVID, particularly in relation to supporting people with learning disabilities.
Well, I think where I work, there was a fair few staff that actually went off because they got COVID.
All right. Yes.
Yeah, and that put a lot of stress on the remaining team. Yeah. Because then we had to have agency staff who really didn't know the service users, and it became quite difficult. Yeah. Even for the service users, it was very difficult because they didn't, connect with the new staff that were in and out the whole time. So that was very difficult. Yeah. They didn't understand why they had to be indoors all the time. That made life even more difficult.
Yeah. I mean, both there's several sort of things there, and all of them cropped up in the milestones experience as well. Maybe not too much people. I mean, certainly some staff got COVID, but not like an overwhelming proportion of a team. But it did happen, and also people had to furlough as well. So that exact experience, Gloria, the pressure put on to the remaining regular staff was quite great, and compounded, as you said, with worries about, you know, the client group, how the restrictions were going to impact on them. Yes, yes. Anybody else got anything to say on this topic?
I came back from maternity leave right in the middle of the.
Oh yes, yeah. I interviewed somebody who had a similar experience, Sophie. Yeah,
yeah. I ended up going off sick within about 4 weeks from stress, just because the whole. Yeah. I think everyone was so focused on dealing with COVID, there was no one there to kind of look after people who were coming back.
Yeah.
For maternity leave.
Yes.
Yeah. And we've also had in my service in particular, and I think this is probably the case in lots of places, we've had kind of not a competition, but there's been people who are very, very, very nervous about COVID. And then we've got on the other end of the spectrum, we've got anti-vaxxers, people who don't think COVID is a thing. Yeah. So it's kind of trying to find that balance between.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm being joined by my.
Oh, right. Okay. Hello. Who's this little one, Sophie?
This is Audrey, and she's now
Audrey.
2.
Yeah.
Hi, Audrey.
Well, it's lovely to see her. Yes. Yeah.
You're gonna go now? Yeah. Okay. You sit there and be quiet.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a strange experience coming back off maternity leave, and then. Yeah, I've gone full circle now, and I'm back in my original position, but I did end up resigning, going back as a support worker, and then reapplying as team leader. So I've gone full circle now. But yeah, it was really difficult coming back into a COVID environment where you've got so many extra things to deal with.
Yes, I
on top of the normal.
Somebody did exactly what you did, Sophie. She came back. Oh, I don't know. It was probably in June. You know. After maternity leave, she'd been kept in touch, and it was a home which had a couple of deaths as well. So she shared in, you know, that experience, but she had exactly, you know, she says that she felt overwhelmed by all the stuff that she had to catch up with. It was, you know, 10 times worse than it would normally be coming back from maternity leave. And also,
yeah, and I think there's almost a kind of sense that. People who've gone through the COVID experience working in care, and then you come into that and you haven't shared that experience with them.
Yeah, it's almost like survivor guilt, isn't it? Yeah. But my colleague also, she said that, you know, because she's a team leader, she came back into the situation where there was all these demands and stuff and new stuff going on, and immediately her colleagues felt that she would have all the answers to everything, and to a certain extent she probably put that burden onto herself, the feeling that she had the answers for everything. You should have the answers for everything. Yeah. So January was just pretty overwhelming for her. Yes. Anything else that anybody would want to share about stressors associated with the pandemic?
Yeah, so when I started the pandemic, I was on one of the rehab wards.
Right.
And we found the patients were quite sort of stressed that they weren't able to see their families and their loved ones. They felt so isolated, and especially some of the elderly patients that weren't very tech savvy. They had no way of really communicating with their with them. So I think a few of them we did try at one stage try a bit of an iPad, and we trying to set it up for some of the patients. It worked with some of them, which was great, and then others, because they didn't have understanding of technology, they weren't able to. But that really impacted, I think, on them their rehab and their goals and what they wanted to get out of being in hospital. And it really impacted them, and then it impacted everybody else around as well.
Yeah. I think that folks with learning disabilities everybody was affected by that, weren't they? They sort of not been able to see people very dear to them. I think it just affected people with learning disabilities more because they have less people in their lives. So if they can't see families, siblings, it's disproportionate impact, really.
Yeah, and it's that understanding, isn't it? Trying to explain why they can't see their love. Sometimes didn't understand.
And even if people were successful, they weren't you know, you still have the repetitive sort of questioning. You know, people, what I find is that people had to have the same conversations again and again with the people that they supported. Of course, you know, anything which affects the folks that we support affects the staff who support them. So, you know, it's just like a big, massive stressor for people, I think.
Yeah, that was like our guys, because they were extremely autistic and not been able to do their routines.
Yeah.
I mean, and not be able to do the routines that they're usually used to doing, and because they couldn't do the routines, and they didn't understand why they couldn't do these things because of the COVID. You know, and it's just, it's really hard, you know, to try and explain to them they can't do them. You know.
Yeah. I know. Again, this, you know, when I go onto the slides, I will reiterate all you said, Nicola. I just realised who was speaking. I can't see you, but I heard
Sorry,
you.
I'm sort of hands-on. I'm not meant to be, but I'm hands-on at the minute, so I'm just trying to do two things at once.
Oh, wow. Well, there you go. I applaud you for that. I can't do that anymore. I don't think the multitasking. I can barely do one task at a time, to be honest. Okay, so shall I put the slides up again? Okay, right. So I'm going to go through now a précis of the stressors that I discovered during the research project. I mean, it was a lot of rich detail produced by the study. So this sort of, I'm not sure if it gives a full sort of understanding of the range of stressors. So one of the things initially was anxieties about putting into practice guidelines set by Milestones Trust, the organisation that I work for, particularly if there was conflicts of or disparities between what the government was saying or other organisations were saying. I mean, got to bear in mind, a lot of this relates to feelings or perceptions people had April, May, June last year. There's this feeling that nobody knew what they were doing. And the whole feeling about the communication and processing of information relating to COVID was just overwhelming. Managers, service managers at the very local level felt that they had to find all the answers in an environment where, you know, often colleagues were panicking and catastrophizing, you know, thinking understandably of, you know, worst case sort of scenarios. As I said already, a big source of stress for staff was all the stuff around communicating with and the impact of COVID on people we support. So the big area which was restricted is, well, people couldn't go out much initially, could they? Not even to parks. I mean, there was concessions made for people on the autistic spectrum, but a year or so ago, people were very limited in what they could do, which meant that staff were rather thrown out of their comfort zone. Instead of having this structure of community-based activities to offer people, they had to think in terms of house-based activities, and that was quite sort of onerous. And when people could access community settings, it felt perilous, and it was difficult to get people sometimes to understand the importance, the absolute need for social distancing and wearing masks. A big area of distress for people was the perception, particularly early on, that folks with learning disabilities were in effect being discriminated against. They weren't receiving proper care. There's one particular instance where ambulance staff were quite dismissive and actually, didn't take the person into hospital, and the impact on people was bad, particularly in relation to end of life care. Okay, maybe the folks that people were supporting, they were probably going to die anyhow from COVID. However, if they received more prompt treatment, one person in particular received more prompt treatment, his death would have been far more comfortable and dignified. And that was one of the more poignant sort of aspects of the interview. And actually, it was actually quite sort of emotional, really, that particular incident. Of course, everybody had a massive impact on their personal life. So what it meant was all the sort of stuff that people normally do to manage stress. I mean, supporting people of any vulnerable or complex client group is difficult. It's even more difficult when the stuff that you rely on to relieve your stress is cancelled, like annual leave. People felt that they couldn't take annual leave for the sort of reasons that Gloria mentioned. They didn't want to put the folks that they support into situations where a lot of different people were coming into the environment, and different people increasing the likelihood of cross-infection. So people made the decision not to go on annual leave, even though they probably could have done with a break at the time. Often people were lured into checking emails during their non-work time, particularly local sort of service coordinators, because they just didn't want to miss anything, and they didn't want to they wanted to make sure that their teams and colleagues were supported. So there's a big blurring between work and home life. And just generally, usual modes of relaxation denied, and a whole range. It wasn't just about not being able to go on holiday, but people couldn't pursue hobbies in the same way. They couldn't see their family and friends. And, just a general feelings of sadness and apathy arising from the pandemic. Initially, the lack of availability and the consciousness of discrimination, really, as far as the social care sector is concerned, lack of availability of PPE was felt very sort of acutely. And I know my trust at one point, and I understand exactly why they gave out this instruction. They instructed people not to use masks unless people had overt symptoms. Well, that really felt like putting people at quite a lot of risk of cross-infection, but they were doing it because they knew they had limited supplies of PPE, particularly masks. I mean, that was addressed, within a couple of weeks, but we had a couple of weeks where, people felt very anxious about the lack of availability of PPE, the feeling that it might run out at any point. And of course, I expect we all sort of feel this still, the discomfort about wearing masks and aprons and gloves. in the, you know, you just can't win. In the summer it was really hot, but you could go outside a bit, sort of alleviate wearing PPE. In the winter, you didn't really have that option quite so much to take a break. And also it's really emerged that the folks that we support especially had difficulties reading expressions. I know it affected me. I got a hearing impairment and not being able to read expressions or read lips because people are wearing masks. That was a big issue as well. I did feel a great swell of pride in my colleagues when I talked to them about anxieties about transmission, because they all were concerned far more about the people they support getting COVID, worries about passing it on to family members, the guilt that they might feel if that did happen, rather than, you know, worrying about they themselves getting COVID. Even so, though, you know, worrying about other people, if anything, it probably sort of expanded the worry rather than just worrying about yourself. Also, there were other sort of things which cropped up in residential settings when people were allowed to do sort of visits in gardens that often visitors, they weren't always great at conforming to social distancing and wearing PPE. Certainly in the early days, having to support people in hospital settings or take people to hospital, that was a big source of stress as well. But you add to that also not being able to visit people and support them in hospital was upsetting as well. Lots of concerns about testing and vaccinations. People felt that the testing regime was introduced slowly. When it was introduced, the fact there was lots of documentation associated with it, which was time consuming and difficult, lots of detail required. That was an added stressor. And who was it mentioned about people sort of having different views about vaccinations? One of you did, didn't you? About was it Sophie, perhaps, talking about?
Yeah, that was me.
Yes, we had exactly that. I mean, the vast majority of people were all up for the vaccine, but a small group of people, colleagues, and also relatives had strong views about not having the vaccine. And again, it was a burden of responsibility to ensure that people that were being supported knew all about the issues relating to the vaccine. And sort of rolling out the vaccine program for the people we support, I think that was probably a bit stressful as well, though I think it happened so quickly that maybe people just got on with it and, you know, it wasn't quite as stressful as it could have been. But the whole thing about ensuring compliance and what to do if people did have limited capacity, there's probably a lot of anguish about that, although I didn't come out all that much in the interviews, probably because I did the interviews more before the vaccine program really sort of got momentum. A few organizational concerns. So what Gloria was talking about before about staff shortages due to illness and shielding and furlough. There was a rule introduced that you could only work in 2 services. So that had a big impact on small supported living services who, you know, struggled to sort of attract bank staff, and we really, what it meant was people who did most of the sessions or shifts, they had to do all of them. But bank staff in particular really struggled with the 2-service rule because they could only work in a couple of places and their income tended to fall because they just weren't getting enough work. Just a general feeling of isolation because area managers and service managers didn't sort of visit services. They weren't allowed to, really. So it was the people actually in services who had to implement protocols, but were sort of in a situation where they felt quite isolated. And sometimes the managers were rather insensitive and dismissive of concerns. Didn't happen a lot, but of course you only need 1 or 2 instances of that to really stick in people's minds and be really upsetting. And sometimes there's a feeling that those managers were quite distant, and they're trying to impose unworkable solutions. I wish I could give you an example here, but to be honest, I can't think of one off the top of my head. But it was a real concern that sometimes people weren't able to work with their usual colleagues or the people they support, and they really miss them, partly due to the sort of limitations on the number of services people could work in. Some people felt that our temporary sort of staff system didn't work very well. Sometimes people had to be redeployed from our daycare services. So it was great to have those people, but they had limited understanding of people, individuals, and they were less effective advocates for people because they didn't know them very well. And this was very noticeable in the early days of COVID, where certainly the folks that we supported, when they were getting ill, they really needed people to stick up for them and get effective treatment. And that was difficult for redeployed or unfamiliar staff to do that. Whole areas where people felt that, they were treated unfairly or let down. In my organization, whole groups of people, including myself, who normally would have lots of contact with services and would visit those services, weren't allowed to anymore. And certainly staff providing direct support sort of really felt the difference, that they were putting themselves at risk, going in daily to support the people that they really cared for, whereas their senior colleagues, from their perspective, had the luxury of working from home and keeping themselves safe. And they felt that even though they fully understood why that was happening, and they also understood that people probably didn't want to work from home, but it didn't stop the feelings of unfairness, particularly if sometimes people rang services for data relating to COVID, I don't know, about 9:30, just as you're sort of helping a couple of people have a bath or have their breakfast, Again, people understood the need to collect data relating to the pandemic, but, it felt a bit insensitive ringing at just a time when, services are going to be really sort of busy. Few other things, sometimes people were redeployed. It felt like redeployment was implemented inconsistently. Particularly in the early days, some staff refused to work with people with COVID symptoms. this was people who tended to be quite vulnerable themselves. As the months went on, our very stringent cleaning protocols, in some areas, people became rather complacent about those, and that caused stress to colleagues because of the awareness that they weren't necessarily following things through as assiduously as they should be. And going back to the extra cleaning duties, people felt a big pressure with respect to that, the fact that they had to do a lot of cleaning, and their people on the ground were tasked with doing all the in-house testing and all the documentation. And again, this is where sometimes, this is probably an example of the insensitivity sometimes of some managers who felt that they had the outlook, well, you're not going out so much with people, so you've got more time to do these sort of things, which wasn't really the case, because there's still an onus to provide activities for people who, there's more of an onus to provide activities because people couldn't go out, if you see what I mean. It's just a little bit more difficult to provide activities in the house if you're not really used to it. So there wasn't the sort of time, there wasn't loads of time to do the extra cleaning. Right, the whole areas of learning and the use of IT was a very potent area. People really miss their conventional study days and the interactions you got from sitting around the table. I don't know about other organisations, but a lot of the teams I'm involved with, they have whole team days where they sort of do a bit of learning, have a conventional team day, get a chance to sort of action plan. Well, all that went out the window. Online and Zoom training were okay, you sort of been in the system for a while, but for new staff, it didn't seem quite adequate. And although people started doing team meetings by video conference, and they carried on doing referrals and assessments and recruit people, there were limitations to the use of video conferencing. And although people made massive strides, they really went the extra mile to support relatives and the folks they supported to use video conferencing. It was pretty stressful, because they were sort of having to learn it themselves and then teach, relatives who didn't have a lot of understanding of technology. And certainly the folks that we support who, actually quite embraced Zoom calls and stuff like that, but they couldn't really sort of set it up all by themselves. So doing all that sort of thing was another big area of stress. Right, okay, lots around loss and bereavement. This was very much the sort of picture for April and May 2020, March and April 2020, where milestones, we had a lot of people get COVID, having to go into hospital, needing end of life support, either in hospital or at home. So, that was emotionally sort of demanding and also frightening if you had to sort of go visit people in hospital. And certainly junior managers really felt, the burden of supporting colleagues through bereavement when they themselves were grieving. And it really felt that they didn't have the chance to say goodbye to people properly. due to restrictions on funeral services and not being able to hold memorials in homes. Right, okay. So that's enough of the stressors. My goodness me, I feel like I've probably depressed you all to the point of extremely low mood going for all that. However, it'd be nice to sort of spend the next part talking about coping strategies. And I've got lots which emerged from the study, but it'd be really great to sort of hear what coping strategies you and your colleagues employed during the pandemic. So it's over to you for a much needed dose of positivity. I'm really depressed and sad after going through all that sort of stuff. I need you guys to tell me the positive stuff that you did during the pandemic to keep yourself sane and happy. So anybody got anything to share on that? And it, you know, it could be quite a mundane sort of thing, you know, it doesn't have to be anything blooming complex or fancy.
I was part of a team called Clinician Care. So I actually work for an agency supplying workers to help you guys.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And we have a clinician care team. So a team of 3 people who are just designated for the well-being of our workers.
Okay, yeah. This sounds good stuff. Yeah, yeah.
So we had, I guess, 2 specific roles. One was just a general check-in with people who we knew were working at sites that may be more challenging than others.
Yeah, yeah.
But we also had instances where we had some of our workers, I think over the space of, I guess, the worst of the pandemic, we probably had about 15 to 20 people that had COVID, some of which lived alone, and they would call us and go, you know, or we'd call them and check in saying, how you doing? Well, yeah, I know, I'm asymptomatic, but I can't go out, I've got no food. So we would do an online shop. We would arrange for a shop to be done. If we couldn't get a slot, a member of staff would go and do a shop. So they had basics and then just drop it off and leave it at their front door for them. So we made sure that all the way through, and it wasn't just clinician care. This is something that was kind of, it's really heavily embedded within our company about it being about family. Our clinicians are like our family. Any contact that was made, we were always checking in on their well-being, making, you know, seeing how they were. If they weren't great, if it, you know, if it wasn't good, then it would come straight across to clinician care for follow-up calls and check-ins. And then we would diarise it and we would check in maybe every couple of days on depending on how they were, how much contact they wanted. So from our point of view, we, you know, we did our utmost to make, because we weren't on that front line, we weren't doing it. We were hearing the stories, you know, whether it be from them on the news, in papers, we knew it wasn't great out there. So it was kind of, it was a point of, you know, clinician care had always been in the background. But when this happened last year, it was really brought to the forefront. And like I said, the team grew because we knew that we needed more people to be supporting our workers.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful to hear. And it'll cause a little bit with, you know, people's experiences within milestones. Yeah. What about anybody else got any views on that? Anything that they did personally, which was stress relieving?
Yeah, for me, it was sort of, because I was, well, I still am, sadly, but working from home, I was given a bit like your job, Esther. I was the one that was the contact point for everyone. I was given a list of everybody that had COVID and had to be off. So I was like doing the calls, making sure they were okay. And I think, unfortunately, some people have, even now, are still off and really ill because of it.
Really, I must admit, we had a couple of people who were very, very poorly. We had one hospitalised with it, but fortunately they are back to health and they're back taking shifts again now. So that's really nice.
Yeah, one of our ladies staff actually got her kidneys were really badly affected, so now she's got to have kidneys transplant, which is just weird, but so it's very, very difficult, and it has been for some people, I know that, but it was something that we decided to do as a team. So it was quite helpful, but
yeah,
you know, just puts a lot of stress on somebody, I suppose.
Yeah.
I found it very hard not being able to just that whole, you know, if, in some instances you have someone crying on the phone, because they feel it's such a loss, and you can't, like, you know, you can't give them a hug, you can't just things that, you know, tactile person, put your arm around them, and not being able to do that for people is incredibly hard.
I certainly miss that as a serial hugger myself. You know, I absolutely sort of miss that. Yeah, I saw a colleague. Well, I've seen her over the last 15 months, and she's somebody who's very close. Used to work with me years ago. I saw her on Monday for the first time in real life. We must have hugged one another about 4 times that morning. Actually, I started to say, I got to get my quota in team for the last 15 months. Yeah, I think a lot of people miss that. I probably should have highlighted that in the study. Actually, you know, people sort of said that they miss the tactile side of things as much as the social contact. What about other sort of stress relieving sort of strategies? Anybody else got anything, you know, sort of individual stuff that you did, irrespective of where you're working directly with people with learning disabilities? Anybody do anything which they felt was really helpful?
I think we've just been like, this is more to do with the support, but because I work in an outreach service, so it's been really difficult when there's not been anywhere to go. So we've been doing a lot of stuff that's like going on walks, but just kind of working on those relationships with the team and having a sense of humor, and just little things like McDonald's hot chocolate, because that's the only place we've been able to go. But just trying to kind of keep everyone's morale up a little bit, and I think that's something my team in particular have missed. But just like enjoying the little things.
That is a theme that comes out in my study. You know, a greater appreciation of the small things in life, a greater, you know, just going for a walk and getting a bit of fresh air, a greater appreciation of small kindnesses as well. So somebody mentioned about, you know, volunteers and people like that helping out, I think, earlier on, and you know, sort of really celebrating those sorts of things. Yeah. Anything else? Sorry, I
was going to say, I think from a personal point of view, aside from work, I feel like COVID almost didn't happen to a certain extent. I was at home with my family. My boys are grown up, and we just had more family time. But we are, you know, we as a family, luckily, we do get on very well. So, you know, we'd have film nights. My husband built a bar last summer, which was almost compulsory. You know, we'd sit out there, we'd be drinking, we'd have barbecues, and it would be their girlfriends live with us as well. So there was 6 of us, and it was almost like as soon as the laptops went off at the end of the day, it was almost like an ongoing party without sounding blasé about it. But we were just always together and always doing. And so when I hear of people that have, you know, who've struggled, I find it really hard to relate that. I can understand it. You know, prior to this, I was a teacher, and I know that there were lots of young mums at home in flats, and you know, you kind of sit there and think, we've got a lovely garden in a really nice area with fields all around us, and I felt very kind of apart from lots of people that I was hearing on the news that were really struggling with it. There's almost a sense of guilt at some points when you think about it. But as a whole, kind of, like I said, I worked from home. So that was where I was. We were all kind of very isolated, but I guess, like I said, we were fortunate. We get on, we're you know, kids are grown up, but there wasn't homeschooling to deal with or anything like that.
I sort of had a similar sort of experience, Esther, in a way, in that the pandemic didn't hit me as hard as some people.
Yeah.
Probably because I was able to go in and do work and see people. My role meant that I actually could, after the first week or so, few weeks, I did go and start going in. So I saw people. Unlike you, I don't have loads of people living with me and my wife, and that was great as well. I celebrated to the utmost degree the fact that my 4 children has all gone off and gone to live elsewhere. That was wonderful. But again, we have a nice garden. We had, we could use that. I do feel a lot of sympathy for, especially my youngest daughter, who lives in a flat with her partner and doesn't have that sort of resource. But I found that I myself, I just read more. I just put aside going out to places, and I thought, oh, I'll read more. Oh, I studied more as well, actually. So
we've actually now got a designated family night. So once a month, first weekend of the month, we now have a designated family night where one person, whether it's a film or whatever it might be, but we have the first weekend of the month, we have one night where we all do something. And had it not been for COVID, we probably would never have done that. You just go off and do your own thing. But I definitely don't think as a family, it had an impact on us, bringing us closer together.
Yeah. I know my wife. Sorry, who was?
Sorry, I was just going to say I work with one colleague someone on my team, and she was saying that if she didn't go to work, she wouldn't see anybody. So it was really important to us to kind of make sure that she could keep working as much as possible. So she went into another service and started a walking club. So it's just kind of making sure that she had somewhere to go, because just not seeing anybody, it would have destroyed her.
I
was going to say I felt like I was quite lucky that I could work all the way through, because it's just a bit normal, whereas other people, that's how I felt.
One of my sort of brief conversations with somebody who's relatively new to care work, and that was one of the positives, actually. A lot of people who wouldn't have thought of care work but couldn't do other jobs came into our services during the summer of last year. And she sort of said that she felt much able to cope with the pandemic compared with her peers who had to work from home or had to be furloughed or whatever. She felt that coming into work, working with people, was advantageous for her, it was beneficial. So I suppose, that's another positive, from issues. A lot of it comes down to sort of feels like almost making the best of small things at times, and being creative. What you said.
I was going to say, one thing that I did at home just to de-stress myself was I fell in love with baking and cooking, and I've always cooked meals, but to actually just cook for fun and be creative. And then I brought that into work, and that had a massively positive impact on the people we support, that who would cook their own meals with support anyway, but forget that it had to be done for a meal or for a chore, and just cook for fun, bake fun things, mix things together and experiment, and also be a sensory activity as well. So that's something that I did myself and then brought into work, and it's been a really fun, exciting activity to do at home as well.
That feels
I think Anna, you've done, I've just noticed Anna's name. I think you've done shifts at my service, Puckle Church Outreach.
I used to be full-time there before I started my nursing training, which is what I'm doing now.
If you want to come back and do some cooking with us, we would love that.
No, I've done some cooking with the guys there, because obviously like things that you don't need to use an oven for, we've done sort of cornflake cakes and things like that. We need come back and cook with us.
It feels like a real win-win, Anna, because not only did it help you with your stress levels, it sort of spilled over into your work environment. Yes, I love to hear stories like that. Any more positive stuff that people did, which was helpful to relieve their stress levels? again, however mundane.
I've done a lot of crochet. I've been doing a lot of crocheting.
Yeah, yeah. I don't disparage crocheting. My youngest daughter, who's a bit of a young fogey, yeah, because crochet got this rather sort of, pattern to it, hasn't it? Yeah, she loves crocheting as well, actually. Yeah, crochet, I could see that because something practical keeps your hands occupied, and there's a problem.
Yeah, and I'm trying to get my colleagues to do it as well. So, because it's just something that keeps your mind busy and you can make something and...
Yeah.
It's very relaxing.
Yeah.
It's very relaxing.
I found I did more gardening because, not only because it was something physical, but also it was something creative as well, making like a nice looking space. Yeah. And that, again, rather like Anna's sort of thing, the cooking, it's not spilled over into my work life, but I sort of kept it going, But it has a bit, because it's given me a more appreciation of the importance of natural things. And I am actually going to, Alan Kellis did a session on this a few months ago, and I'm trying to work with him to promote those sorts of things across services. So yeah, it has spilled over into my work life.
I was going to say, building on from what you just said, Alan, and what Sophie said before about appreciating the small things, and when we're going out for walks with people, rather than just doing the walk and then moving on to the next activity, as we often do, because we like to keep people busy, or or they have busy schedules, but actually just taking a slower pace and appreciating nature and listening to the sounds and feeling the leaves and looking at the colors. And I think, that's the way a walk should be, and it's a whole sensory experience as well. So well as exercise. So that's been great.
I'm hoping that this will carry over, because a lot of people that I talked to, it's pretty clear they were going for more walks and stuff like that. And I'm hoping that that will continue. I want to try and build on that momentum myself, because I think, residential services, we often get into this pattern of, going to a cafe and having coffee is sort of like a big part of stuff, isn't it? Or going to the pub and having a shandy or a beer or whatever, which are great things to do, but there's other stuff which is, probably more helpful, to be honest, And I think, walking and what you're saying, Anna, about, really appreciating nature in a more overt sort of way, I think I'm hoping it's going to be a bit more of a thing, in LD services.
Particularly if someone is feeling distressed or having a bit of a bad day, sometimes the coffee shop and having a cup of tea is just not appropriate, or it's not really helpful for them in that moment. But being out in nature,
it's a crowded environment. It's sort of, perhaps too much stimulation, the caffeine factor, all that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Are we okay to carry on, or do you feel a need a break from the screen? It's up to you guys.
No, I'm good.
Carry on, I think.
Carry on. I feel I'm still a bit anxious about my connection, so I sort of feel the need to carry on before something disastrous happens to my Zoom connection. So what I'm going to put up now is coping strategies that were identified within the study. So the thing about this, though, there was a lot of, what's the word, ambiguity, paradoxical sort of experiences. I got that. Yeah, that is the first one. Yeah. So although people felt that the daily briefings that Milestones Trust put out were overwhelming, they also felt at the same time that, in fact, the daily briefings, they were very clear and helpful. You know, people had the same sort of, you know, held contemporaneously the same views. Although it was overwhelming and people struggled with it, you know, especially to begin with, to be honest, the daily briefings were clear and helpful. They gave a way forward, especially if helpful local managers summarized those briefings for their colleagues and the people they supported. Although people didn't like not being able to experience face-to-face training. In fact, the training videos, you know, things like how to don and doff PPE, hand washing, lateral flow testing, all that sort of stuff. In fact, the training videos were better than face-to-face training because you could go back to them. I know I did, especially when the first time I did the lateral flow testing. I thought, blimey, you know, God, so many steps to this. Yeah. Having said that, people really sort of felt the relief and pressure when there was no need to have a daily briefing, a daily COVID briefing. So you say, you know, that paradoxical sort of thing was very common. Notwithstanding the sometimes aversion to technology and the differences that it brought, people to a certain extent embraced it in the ways that you'd sort of expect. Like Milestones introduced this keeping in touch meeting, a weekly meeting which anybody could drop into, a Zoom sort of thing. And that was sort of, you know, embraced quite avidly. Although interesting that, I rather think is falling off now. It sort of had its time. But one of the things which people did sort of spontaneously, especially small supported living teams where you didn't see one another very much, they formed WhatsApp groups. This was a sort of example of grassroots sort of action, really. And those proved very helpful, mainly to give one another support, but sometimes it meant, you know, the practical outcomes, you know, so a shift sort of covers needed. People would just communicate within the WhatsApp group to sort of try and solve those problems before going down a more formal sort of route. And people have started having Zoom team meetings, and that's been a bit of a help. It's not been as good, but it's better than nothing. What else was helpful from a managerial point of view? Practical help and prompt help. You know, the people really at the local level felt that they were floundering, you know, with things like cleaning protocols and testing protocols. So having prompt help from managers, the clinical lead, helping out promptly, and being available for queries was very sort of helpful. People wanted managers to provide solutions, but they were happy if, in fact, senior managers admitted that they didn't have all the answers there and then, as long as they went off and sought further advice and came back with an answer. So, you know, the rather people were frank and sort of said that, well, I don't know the answer. I think that was sort of, you know, the genuineness of that sort of response sort of resonated with people. And also it made junior people feel that, well, it's okay for themselves not to have all the answers immediately. It was sort of like a shared sort of feeling then. But of course, you know, those senior managers had to, you know, go away and find the answers. The two parts were needed. People felt, especially again, junior managers, service coordinators, that they needed to have the chance to have a bit of a vent, a bit of a rant, but sometimes that needed to be in an informal setting and not in a well-attended team meeting or keeping in touch meeting. They had to have those opportunities, perhaps on a one-to-one basis, just to let off a bit of steam without those managers who had to listen, being judgmental or trying to impose sort of unworkable sort of solutions. Right, there's a lot around anything that people did to sort of aid the people they supported was essentially stress relieving for the folks that supported them. So anything really that people came up with which sort of facilitated contact or provide substitute sort of activities. People did develop a whole range of activities, more craft or home-based activities. Sometimes those activities, to a certain extent, replicated community activities. So instead of going to the cinema, people have film nights, and some of the activities actually ended up with people becoming more independent as well. So that was, again, that was a real win-win. Making the most and celebrating any sort of special events, birthdays, Christmases. Some people were able to go out on holidays in that window towards the end of summer last year, so that people really took the opportunity to do that when they could. And just generally, I mean, the development of IT skills and using video conferencing was a big area where staff were able to help the people that they support. Staff were very sort of proud of that, and they felt, they really done their job. And of course, the folks that they supported, it was a win-win-win, people were being helped to develop, they were becoming more independent, and they were keeping in contact with their family through using video conferencing, and they had a greater sense of self-worth because they were doing this new stuff which they hadn't done before. Celebrating achievements was a big thing. It is one of my themes, really. I sort of feel that we don't celebrate hard-won achievements as much as we should. I think lots of amazing things happen in learning disability circles outside of COVID, and staff and the people who we support, they're very nonchalant about their achievements, but just the whole thing about people that we support wearing masks to go out, abiding by social distancing, learning really difficult things like that, but achieving it, and being involved with clapping for carers and supporting one another. I think that was a big area of celebration, quite rightly so. I've got to say that a lot of the folks that we support, they put the general public to shame with their sort of forbearance around not being able to do stuff and their compliance in wearing masks in social settings. But the staff derived great pride from helping people avoid contracting COVID. That really, a year in, they sort of reflected, well, nobody's got COVID in a particular service. This is a wonderful achievement. And generally a reflection, as we said before, on simple things that previously they took for granted. And, you know, we come up with loads of examples of that. You know, just simple things like going for a walk, having a nice meal, fresh air, looking at the garden, that sort of stuff. And also, you know, in the areas where, you know, people have losses, either due to COVID or due to just other circumstances, we felt really the need to try and find ways to, you know, memorialize the people who had died, especially if they hadn't been able to attend the funeral. And, you know, that was a feature in a couple of the interviews. If they couldn't sort of memorialize the people at that particular time, they had plans, you know, in terms of the example would have been, you know, oh, in August, we're going to plant 2 roses for this particular person who died and her friend, you know, that sort of thing, you know, and have a proper sort of send off. They had clear plans about how they were going to remember those people that they lost. And that was helpful for those people. If they couldn't do it there and then, they could do it in the future. And they derive comfort from that. Okay, whole areas of where people supported one another, both in practical sort of ways, by facilitating breaks for one another, swapping shifts, covering people's days off, so you know, from other homes, so service managers could sort of literally switch off their phone or not have to think about work because their mate was covering that particular service. Building in opportunities for praise and encouragement as the daily sort of norm. I think that was a big thing, you know, people sort of, you know, really going out to sort of praise one another for, you know, stuff that they'd done. Some people actually considered coming to work as being a much safer environment than an outside environment. And I really sort of got that because they were working with like-minded people who were all working for the same aim to keep the area infection free. Point 5, working extra shifts to ensure no unfamiliar staff worked in an environment. That was a big thing through April, May and June of last year. And that was, again, it's that paradoxical sort of side of things. That was a burden for people, but also it gave them comfort because if they worked extra shifts, unfamiliar people weren't coming into the environment. So that was beneficial at so many levels. It meant that people weren't disrupted by having unfamiliar faces. It meant the risk of infection was lowered. People were prepared to do that for several months and cancel their holidays in order to sort of reduce the risk of cross-infection and also to make sure that generally people weren't supported by unfamiliar people. Praise and practical support from doctors and other outside agencies was really great. Right, I probably should add there also, we were quite successful in getting a lot of volunteers to help out, not just with shopping and stuff like that, and but also working with individuals or befriending them or phoning them, and that was a big help to staff. They really appreciated that, especially the practical support in the early parts of the pandemic. Although there were reservations about lots of aspects of how the trust, Milestones Trust, responded, generally people felt that they did become better at recognizing need, and recruitment improved, and the bank office improved. And there's a general sort of reassurance derived from the feeling that the trusts were on it, and they were performing better than other organisations. The introduction of the vaccination program, that was a big sort of boost for people. It sort of felt like, you know, the beginning of the end all those months ago when people started having their vaccines. Staff and people who supported, and the fact that it was rolled out pretty quickly, you know, was very helpful, I think, for people's mental welfare. As was the fact that after the first couple of weeks, end of March, beginning of April 2020, we have relatively few problems with PPE, if any. I mean, I know this actually, not just from my research project, but also because it was something that in my role as an auditor, which I was doing then, I had to scrutinize that, and you know, it settled down really quite quickly. Just that first couple of weeks of anguish still sticks in people's minds, and that's quite understandable. A lot of the things that people reflected on was the importance of their own resources, their own personal traits, experiences, activities. There's a little bit thinking about, especially to begin with, that we're in survival mode. We had to sort of get through the next few months, but that quickly evolved into avoiding too much wishful thinking. Oh, you know, maybe in a few months' time this will all be over. That was quickly knocked onto their head, and people really started embracing more what they could do in the here and now, embracing not having to rush and get people out for community activities, celebrating the empathy and kindness of volunteers and other professionals and other people that came into their lives, even if it wasn't very helpful. Like and one of the people in one of the homes that I interviewed, the local GPs made scrubs for all the staff, but for some of those people, the sizes weren't right, or they fell to pieces quite quickly. However, it was still a kind act, even though it didn't go as well as expected. It was still, you know, really sort of appreciated. People felt that they got to know others through virtual meetings, and they were particularly appreciated colleagues who could listen to their sort of difficulties, who actually understand the sort of things that they were going through. So it wasn't just having people to listen to, it was good to having people who listened and could empathize because they'd had similar sort of experiences or worked in care settings. And people also felt that if they had a lot of experience and had gone through difficult sort of experiences in their careers already, they felt that they could draw on that. And they felt that they had developed resilience already. The area of activities was quite interesting because it was all the sort of things that, you know, we talked about already, you know, things like gardening, craft work, yoga, knitting, Zoom events, walking. And, you know, staff came up with a whole list of those sort of activities. Once or twice people said, well, I drank more and I had more fights, but that was just facetious sort of stuff, really. I think genuinely people tended to embrace doing those sorts of really sort of helpful sort of activities. It helped if people compartmentalize their lives, switching off phones, avoiding looking at emails out of work hours. And it also helped if people sort of acknowledged when they were tired, and they cancelled shifts if they had booked in too many, or took annual leave. And staff colluded with one another to sort of make those sort of things happen. You know, they didn't judge one another. People did cancel shifts, and they tried to facilitate people take annual leave. So, you know, just to finish up, a few sort of, well, these are sort of random thoughts, which found a little bit part of the discussion in my completed piece of work, and also, you know, gave ideas for the future, really. Right, so as I sort of said already, sometimes there's a paradoxical nature to the findings. The same stuff which was stressful was also, to a certain extent, stress relieving. So communication around COVID felt overwhelming, especially to begin with, but also it was helpful as well, because communication from senior people at Milestones in the form of a daily briefing was just really, really helpful in giving clear guidance. IT training, the use of IT was stressful, and it wasn't a complete sort of answer by any means, but also people embraced it and did get some benefit from it, particularly, as I said, you know, being able to go back and look at sort of training films. Testing was sort of slow in coming in, but once it was established, it sort of given people confidence and in terms of reducing cross-infection. Similarly with the vaccine, you know, okay, you know, there have been sort of discussions around, you know, the fact that some people are really anti-vaccines, and maybe difficult to implement the program with some people with learning disabilities, but generally that's been a real big positive. I did reflect a bit on the government report that was produced a few years ago, 5 Ways to Wellbeing. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's one of those really good pieces of research, which I'm not sure whether it's been popularized as much as it should have been, really. So 5 Ways to Wellbeing, they are making sure that you get plenty of exercise and activity, that you follow learning pursuits, that you try and build in mindfulness sort of activities, and you maintain contacts. And the 5th one is all about giving, you know, sort of doing things for people. My reflection was on the lines of, well, you know, often people were sort of, they couldn't exercise in the way that they could before. Their learning was impaired. Colleges were closed. You couldn't have face-to-face sessions at work. It's difficult to do mindfulness stuff when you're in the middle of a pandemic, and of course, our ability to maintain contact with people was impaired. So my reflection was sort of like the giving and the appreciation of giving became a more disproportionate, had a disproportionate or a greater sort of emphasis, because other ways of sort of maintaining mental health were impaired in different ways. Not totally. I mean, you can still go out for walks, you can sort of still do learning in other ways, and you can maintain contacts by Zoom and phone, loads of ways to maintain contact. But there are all those areas were impaired, but the giving was a real opportunity. So I just did wonder whether that sort of, there seemed to be a greater sort of appreciation of the need to give praise and help out people with shift changes, stuff like that. And a greater appreciation when people did things for yourself as well. Another reflection was the importance of genuineness, transparency, and frankness. So managers admitted they didn't have the answers. That sort of area was quite prominent, I think. So I had a few recommendations for the future, which I will eventually share with Milestones Trust in a more coordinated way. So I think, it seemed to be clear that people need a space for non-judgmental listening, the ranting sort of opportunities. We should celebrate achievements more. I have a big impact in trauma-informed support. I was writing about it as part of another study all throughout the pandemic. That was fun, writing about trauma-informed support whilst going through a massive global trauma. But maybe and I provide training in trauma-informed support around milestones, but maybe I should be doing it not just in framing it in terms of the people we support, but maybe framing it in terms of the experiences that everybody has had in light of the pandemic, particularly staff. It sort of felt like training resilience development for both staff and people we support is really important. A little bit that comes from my appreciation of how well the folks that we support have coped. I think, again, they've been, massive role models for the rest of society. These people with lots of complexities in their lives, lots of difficulties, massively impacted upon by the pandemic, but they've done pretty well, really. And maybe we should reflect on why those folks are so resilient and celebrate it and learn from it a little bit. I think we should have a greater focus on staff well-being, including talking more about those, making people more aware of those particular 5 ways to well-being strategy and having more wellness action planning. I think, another practical sort of thing, email communication can be very intense, and it was particularly intense at the time of the pandemic, and that wasn't helpful. And maybe we should be thinking about that a little bit more, about how constant emails affect people. Thank goodness everybody says, oh, thank goodness he's finished, no more slides. Sorry, that felt a bit relentless, me going for all that material. And I've come to the end of the presentation now, but have you got any more thoughts, any things that you would like to say around either the stressors or coping strategies, or maybe about my point towards the end around how you feel the folks that we support have coped with the pandemic? Any thoughts on that?
I think that what we've really seen from the pandemic is, like, given the right support, the people we support can change their routines and they can get used to new things. And I'm finding now that it's harder getting the staff to change from COVID routines to getting out and about again. I'm finding that transition harder than the people we support.
I've got to say that I never feel in services I've been involved with, I've done enough to help promote active learning or structured learning for people. And I'm hoping that the fact that the folks that we support have demonstrated their learning capacity is going to give a little bit more impetus to stuff like that. And I think, I think that will help staff indirectly, because the folks that we support have given more opportunities to learn. They're probably less likely to be challenging. They're going to feel greater about themselves, and to be honest, staff are going to feel better about themselves because they've helped the folks that they're really, a big part of their lives to learn new stuff. Anything else? Any other comments?
From my point of view personally, I just think it's really nice to kind of just have it just kind of reinforced that, like I said, even though I found it relatively easy, there's a whole group of people out there that really didn't find it easy, and they did struggle, but still managed to overcome and place things to make things better and easier for themselves and those that they were supporting.
I really do believe it, that the folks that we support, they could have been far more challenging or far more upset, but they weren't. I mean, that's partly due to the dedicated support from their teams. And I think it's a lot from the, coming from the folks that the folks themselves. They've become resilient because they've had such traumatic lives generally often that they've had to learn to be resilient and forbearing. And I think we should learn from that, to be honest. Yeah, definitely. Anything else before we sort of conclude the session? Well, we got there in the end, didn't we? And I feel far less anxious now. It's all about me than I did at the start of the session. I've expected the internet connection to crash at any moment. Okay, so I'll stop the recording. I will make it available eventually on the website.